Good afternoon, and welcome to our first ever Canadian Pugwash Group e-workshop. I'm Elizabeth Riddell Dixon. I'm a member of the Pugwash Executive, and I'm a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Western. We're hoping that this workshop, which we've entitled Toward a Nuclear Weapon-Free Middle East, is going to be the first in a series of workshops that would explore issues that are vital to peace and justice around the world. Pugwash has a mandate to bring together experts to conduct in-depth discussions of critical issues. But we've had a problem when we have members from coast to coast and travel is so expensive. So we hope that if we organized e-workshops, it would be an effective way of linking our members all across the country, in providing you with stimulating lectures, and also in allowing you to engage with other experts on topics of mutual concern. We chose nuclear weapons, disarmament, and the Middle East as the topic for our first e-workshop because it relates directly to Pugwash's long-standing concern with the abolition of nuclear weapons. We also chose it because the Middle East is a region of vital importance to international peace. And the topic is timely. It gives us an opportunity to hear from the experts on developments at the May meeting of the NPT PrepCon. It's a great pleasure for me to be introducing my co-organizer of today's venue, the person who's also going to serve as our moderator, Ernie Regier, a person who needs no introduction, a person who's highly respected for his work to promote world peace. Ernie is currently the vice chair of the Pugwash Executive. He's a senior fellow in Arctic security at the Simons Foundation. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Waterloo. He's also the former executive director of Project Plowshares. Without further ado, I turn the floor over to Ernie.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, and hello to all, and welcome. It's great to be participating in this, and thank you to all of our participants from various parts of the country, and one guest from Ireland as well, actually. And particularly thanks to Paul and Peter for helping us out and joining us. I'm going to be introducing them in a little more detail in a moment. I wanted also to say a special thanks to our friends at the Security Governance Group, Mark Cedra, Jeff Burt, and Vanessa Humphreys. They've made this all possible and will help keep us online and on track as we go throughout the afternoon. Vanessa has been especially helpful in getting us all through this process, and in fact all three will participate also as people engaged in issues related to security governance, so they'll participate in our discussion as well. As Elizabeth said, it's a new way of holding Pugwash meetings. She's also introduced what was behind us picking the Middle East and nuclear issues there for the first effort. You may be interested in knowing that the International Pugwash Executive has weighed in on this issue and issued a statement in November when the promised international conference was postponed. The International Pugwash then said the future viability of the NPT and possible progress towards peace in the Middle East have been seriously jeopardized. So here we are, and we're very fortunate to have two resource persons with us today who are eminently qualified to survey the dynamics of the current situation and to consider the implications for the NPT and nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And I'm pleased to introduce them both to you. I will introduce them as they speak, and Paul is going to speak first. So first, welcome to Paul. Paul is currently a fellow in international security at the Center for dialogue at Simon Fraser University. He's an adjunct professor in the University School for International Studies and a senior fellow at the Simons Foundation of Vancouver. He's a former diplomat. He spent 4 years as ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and that's known to many of us as Ambassador for Disarmament. He has served in a variety of assignments at Foreign Affairs, including for them in Moscow, Washington, and Brussels, including NATO. He was Director General of two different bureaus in Foreign Affairs, International Security and Security and Intelligence. And he served as head of Canada's delegation to the NPT review process, where, of course, he met the Middle East issue head on. And we've encouraged both Paul and Peter not to feel rushed in making their comments, take the time needed. We're anticipating about 20 minutes for each of them. And after that presentation, I'll invite questions for clarification. In fact, as you're listening to Paul and you have any questions, just use the discussion board on the right of your screen to ask questions, and I'll make sure that gets to Paul at the end of his opening comments. And then after Paul, we'll go to Peter. But Paul, you're on now, and we look forward to your comments.
Good afternoon to you and to the online participants in this e-workshop. I think it's a good innovation, and indeed the topic is very much with us. Now, history is something the Middle East has a surfeit of, and the Middle East dimension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is no exception. The NPT, to use the acronym, entered into force in March of 1970 and currently has 190 state parties, which makes it arguably both the most important and the most widely adhered to international security agreement in existence. Only 4 states remain outside the NPT fold, and those are India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And within the region of the Middle East, therefore, it is only Israel that is not a party to the NPT. And this situation has not escaped the notice of its neighbors in the region. In particular, Arab states, led by Egypt, have long pressed for Israel's adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty to complete the regional coverage of the treaty in the Middle East. And a key opportunity to pursue this objective occurred in 1995 at the Review and Extension Conference of the NPT that was held in New York that year. This was a particularly critical year for the NPT because when it was signed, the original duration of the treaty was 25 years. Therefore, it was due to expire in 1995 unless the treaty membership came to some decision about an extension. And in the event, the decision was unanimous in support of an indefinite extension to the treaty, to the NPT. But that decision, in turn, was part of a package of carefully, painfully even, negotiated agreements. One of those had to do with procedures for a strengthened review process for the treaty. Another had to do with principles and objectives on nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. And the third element of the package was a Middle East resolution. And this latter took the form of a resolution sponsored by the US, the UK, and Russia. These three states are also the three depository governments for the NPT. And that resolution, and I'll read the key operational paragraph, stated as follows, quote, all states in the Middle East to take practical steps in appropriate forums aimed at making progress towards, inter alia, the establishment of an effectively verifiable Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and their delivery systems, and to refrain from taking any measures that preclude the achievement of this objective. End of quotation. Now, I invite you to fast forward 15 years from that adoption in 1995 of the resolution to the 2010 NPT Review Conference. And for those not familiar with the treaty, every 5 years there is a review conference, and that conference has essentially served as the sole decision-making forum for the treaty and its states parties. So the Arab states were particularly frustrated with the lack of implementation, as they saw it, on the 1995 Middle East resolution in the intervening period. And under Egyptian leadership at the 2010 review conference, there was insistence that something significant for follow-up on the 1995 resolution be agreed upon. And there was implied linkage to achieving this and receiving Egyptian and Arab state support for an outcome to that review conference. And again, another important procedural point everyone needs to be aware of is the NPT operates on a consensus basis. That means that all the states participating have to be in agreement on a decision for it to take place. And indeed, any one state can, if it wishes, effectively block the adoption of any outcome from the review conference. And indeed, that was the case in 2005, which was the one review conference where I had direct participation in as the head of the delegation. So Egypt's hand was strengthened at 2010 by the coincident factor that it was acting as chair of the 118 members of the non-aligned movement during the period of the review conference, which gave it additional clout within that context. And so you had what initially seemed like a triumph of Egyptian and Arab diplomacy coming out of the 2010 meeting, and that was a detailed 10-paragraph section relating to the Middle East resolution, which for the first time contained a true operational element. And that element provided for the convening of a conference in 2012 on, and I quote again from the outcome document of the review conference, to be attended by all states of the Middle East on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction, which would take as its term of reference the 1995 resolution. So the Secretary General of the United Nations and the co-sponsors of the 1995 resolution, again, the US, UK, and the Russian Federation, were to appoint a facilitator to prepare for this conference in 2012, and to have that facilitator assist as well in the implementation of any follow-up steps that would be agreed to at the 2012 conference. And in addition, this same convening group were to appoint a host government that would host the envisaged conference. So this action-oriented conclusion from the 2010 review conference was welcomed by the states concerned, but its implementation was far from assured. And the early indicators were not particularly promising in that regard. It took, for instance, over a year for the conveners to designate the host government, which in the end was Finland, and to appoint the facilitator, which again was a senior Finnish foreign ministry official, the Undersecretary of State Jaakko Laajava. Now, Ambassador Laajava quickly went about his new duties, and he initiated a series of consultations with concerned regional states. And by the time of the May 2012 NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, there are basically, in the periods between the 5 quinquennial review conferences, 3, possibly 4 preparatory committee meetings are held. So in May 2012, he was able to submit his first report to the NPT membership, and it was on the basis of over 100 consultations that he and his team had conducted. And I would characterize this report as generally upbeat, and he suggested that the conference was on track to be held in Helsinki, probably in the month of December 2012. Although Laajava did acknowledge that all the key practical elements of agenda, modalities, rules of procedure were still to be finalized. He stressed also that ensuring a successful conference was ultimately the responsibility of all states of the region, and he noted that while the facilitator will continue to seek and foster common ground on the outstanding issues, the full cooperation and engagement between the states of the region remains vital. Well, that cooperation, alas, was not forthcoming. And in late November 2012, I mean, literally a month before the expiration of the year and the agreed timing for the conference, the world was informed through a series of independent press releases from the 4 conveners that the conference was not going to be convened as intended that year. And a close reading of those statements, I think, reveals very distinct differences in the positions being adopted by the individual conveners. The Russian statement, for example, made it clear that it was not in favor of the postponement, and that such a move, in its opinion, could only have been justified if there was consent to specific new dates. And in Moscow's view, those new dates should be fixed at that time, and definitely to have a conference convened no later than April 2013. i.e. before the next NPT Preparatory Committee session was due to be held. The statement of the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, was relatively neutral, but he did express his hope that the conference could be held in, quote, early 2013. The UK statement was more equivocal, indicating that it supported the convening of a conference, quote, as soon as possible, and the facilitator's efforts to conduct further multilateral consultations with a view to arrange a conference in 2013. And finally, the US statement was the most non-committal of the lot. It didn't even refer to any time frame for the conference, but rather stressed the need for regional states to bridge their differences through direct engagement and on the basis of consensus. The statement further warned that the US, and I quote, would not support a conference in which any regional state would be subject to pressure or isolation, end of quotation. Well, I think it's clear that whatever common front had been maintained so far by the conveners was visibly cracking, and although all reiterated their support for the facilitator and his efforts, Layever was not going to benefit from sustained collective pressure from the conveners on the recalcitrant parties. The curtain was raised a little on the behind-the-scenes diplomatic action at the next NPT Preparatory Committee session, which was held in April of this year in Geneva, with the presentation by the facilitator of his second official report to the NPT membership on his mandated mission. And that report indicated that Layeva had presented the states of the region initially in May 2012, and then again in October 2012, a series of papers on the different substantive and outstanding aspects for the conference, but he noted that not all the states had taken a position regarding their actual participation in the conference. And thus it was not possible for him to convene the conference in 2012. In further remarks, Layever said he and his team had now carried out over 300 sets of consultations, and that he had proposed as a next intermediary step the holding of multilateral consultations. Recall, a lot of his activity basically was on a bilateral basis through shuttle diplomacy. He was now suggesting multilateral consultations to consider arrangements for the conference. But these had failed to materialize. And Layever, ever the discreet diplomat, declined to elaborate on why this was. But he did say, quote, more important than to look in the rearview mirror is to look towards the future, end of quotation. And he vowed to continue to pursue his mission with, quote, determination and vigor, although given the positions of the chief protagonists to date, this optimism seemed to reflect the triumph of hope over experience. If the facilitator was reluctant to explain the failure to hold his suggested multilateral consultations, let alone the conference, other participants at the April NPT meeting were not so restrained. The Arab states, in a working paper submitted to the session, outlined in some detail their reaction to the facilitator's proposals, including a sharp critique of the convener's handling of the process. The paper stated that, quote, the unilateral postponement by the conference organizers should be considered a shirking of their responsibilities under the action plan set forth in the final document of the 2010 review conference that impacts negatively on the credibility of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, end of citation. The paper went on to warn that, quote, there is a direct link between the convening of the conference in 2013 and its realization of perceptible success through the initiation of a negotiation process within a specific time frame to achieve that zone free of weapons of mass destruction, and the success of the 2015 review conference and its preparatory committee, period. End of citation. And if I might parse that lengthy sentence for you, I think you will appreciate that it contains some pretty explicit linkage, as well as some fairly thinly veiled threats, relating not only to the necessity to convene the conference in 2013, but also to agree at that conference on some time-bound negotiation to actually achieve that WMD zone. And the implied threat being that the whole future of the 2015 review conference, and indeed even its preparatory meetings, may be held hostage, if you will, to the achievement of those demands. So if this threat to hold the future review conference hostage to the Middle East Zone Conference convening was not ominous enough, the Egyptian delegation provided some additional pyrotechnics at the April NPT preparatory meeting. And in his April 29 statement to that session, the head of the Egyptian delegation decried the postponement as, quote, a flagrant non-fulfillment of agreed commitments, end of quotation, and proceeded to announce that he and his entire delegation would withdraw from the remainder of that preparatory committee session, quote, to protest this unacceptable and continuous failure to implement the 1995 Middle East resolution, end of citation. Now, the non-aligned movement was almost as pointed in its statements, deploring Israel's, quote, undermining the convening of the conference by not declaring its intention to participate in it, end of citation, and calling upon the conveners to obtain in advance, quote, credible assurances regarding the unconditional participation of Israel, end of citation. Projecting ahead to 2015, the NAM also called for, quote, the establishment of a standing committee comprising members of the Bureau of the 2015 Review Conference to follow up intercessionally on the implementation of the recommendations by the Review Conference concerning Israel's prompt accession to the NPT, end of citation. While the U.S. representative at the meeting, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation, Thomas Countryman, expressed support for taking the first half of the first sort of half step, he said, of direct multilateral consultations, and said that a conference could be convened rapidly thereafter, quote, if there existed the political will of the relevant parties to reach consensus on an agenda and other arrangements for the conference, end of citation. At the same time, he indicated that the United States saw an eventual conference as addressing more than Israel's non-adherence to the NPT. Quote, certain proponents of the conference speak as if the only issue to be discussed is Israel. However, an honest discussion must also take into account the large quantities of chemical weapons held by Syria and the fundamental challenge posed by Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, end of quotation. So it would appear that dark clouds are hanging over the NPT as the failure to deliver on the commitment to convene the Middle East Conference in 2012 plays out against a backdrop of continued violence, instability, and mistrust in the region. Iran and Syria have their own compliance problems with the International Atomic Energy Agency to answer, but as NPT states parties, it is convenient for them to detract attention from their issues and redirect it against Israel. Egypt, the traditional leader of the Arab states, has staked a considerable prestige on its achievement at the 2010 Review Conference and has an investment of national pride as much as national security in seeing some tangible manifestation of the WMD free zone realized. Israel, for its part, can continue to play hard to get, and with the credible justification that as a non-NPT state party, it is not bound to comply with decisions taken by the NPT membership. The underlying threat of failure to convene the promised conference is not to regional security so much as it is to the continued authority of the NPT. It is conceivable that some or all of the Arab states and Iran may choose to use the failure to convene the Middle East Conference as a reason for blocking any outcome from the 2015 Review Conference, or even as a pretext for withdrawal from the treaty. The NPT has enough problems of its own without adding the burden of the Middle East conflict to its load, but it unfortunately is now encumbered with this intractable dispute as well. The prognosis for the global nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime is not good. Thank you.
Thanks a whole lot, Paul. That was terrific. There are two questions. One is from Sergey on the prospects for future. If Sergey doesn't mind and you don't mind, I think that's a very good lead-in to the later discussion on future things. And maybe so I think we'll leave that as the introductory question for the later discussion. There's just one other small clarification question, and that is whether Canada weighed in 2010, or rather at the last PrepCom 2013, on these the issue of the Middle East Conference.
Ernie, I'd have to review. I think there was a passing reference in statements made by the Canadian delegation at the April 23rd conference expressing support for the facilitators' efforts and the desirability of convening that conference. But I don't think it went much farther than that.
Okay. Thanks a whole lot. I'm going to ask you to turn off your webcam and ask Peter now to turn his on. And while you're doing that, Peter, I welcome you again and offer a brief introduction. Peter is on the faculty of graduate and postdoctoral studies in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. At the same time, he's an Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. He's also a former diplomat and public servant and served in foreign affairs, national defense, and the Privy Council. He's served as a senior analyst for security and intelligence for the Security and Intelligence Secretariat of the Privy Council. He's an expert and a practitioner in Track 2 initiatives, and is currently involved in such exercises in South Asia and the Middle East. And his Middle East work has also included a stint at SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where he led the Middle East Security and Arms Control Project. So welcome again, Peter, and we look forward to your presentation.
Peter, if you could just unmute your microphone there.
Is that better?
That's better.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think that in terms of what I could contribute to this discussion after Paul's very good introduction to the issues, perhaps I could, as Ambassador Layev has said we shouldn't do, I could look in the rearview mirror a little bit and talk about how we got to where we are. I entirely agree with the sentiment that the officials shouldn't be doing that, because all that they're managing to do is to dredge up old arguments and old disagreements and not go forward. But I think for the purposes of our discussion group today, it might be useful to take a minute to look at some of those discussions and how we got to where we are, because the positions that the main actors in this drama have taken in the past year are positions they've been holding to for about 20 years now in various fora. And I think it might be useful for our listeners today to have a little bit of a flavor of that. I think, first of all, in terms of thinking about the creation of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, it's very important to look at other regions of the world where these zones exist. There are no WMD free zones, but there are nuclear weapon free zones in different parts of the world. And in no case where such a zone has been created, has it been created in the absence of a wider regional system of security and cooperation. In other words, if you look at Asia, at Africa, at Latin America, other regions where there are nuclear weapon-free zones, there is also a wider regional system of dialogue, cooperation on security issues. In Asia, it's ASEAN. In Africa, it's the African Union, and so on. And so I think that it's instructive to note that the Middle East is today the only region of the world, the only major region of the world, where such a zone doesn't exist. Such a regional system doesn't exist. And I think it's instructive as to why we haven't been able to make progress on a WMD free zone, that there is no mechanism within which to embed it, no regional security mechanism within which to embed it. I'll talk for a few moments now about the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group, which was a regional security group of the Middle East peace process. A multilateral group. It was active in the early 90s, from 92 to about 95. It was one of 5 such groups, and it was the only time in history, before or since, that there's been an official track 1 diplomatic process aimed at discussing regional security and arms control affairs in the Middle East. And it existed for about 3 years. It met several times in plenary. There were also some working groups. I was very privileged that I was in foreign affairs at this time, and Canada had been asked to serve as a facilitator of this process, and I got to go to many of the meetings and take part in the ACRES process. It was a fascinating exercise. It had several accomplishments. Several very far-reaching confidence-building measures were negotiated. None of them were ever implemented officially because ACRES ceased to meet in 1995 for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But I've been told that many of the countries of the region have unilaterally implemented these agreements between themselves. It also had a far-reaching discussion of regional security and of disarmament, in particular nuclear disarmament. And it was not able to come to any conclusive end on that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why it fell apart. But anyways, it did have that discussion for the first time. There were, however, some problems with ACRES, and they're problems which I think we recognized in today's situation. First of all, the ACRES group was not inclusive. There were several Middle Eastern countries who weren't invited to participate, and there were a few who decided not to participate. They were invited but decided not to. Those who were not invited to participate by the co-sponsors of ACRES, who were the United States and Russia, were Iran, Iraq, and Libya. And I think that it was basically the United States, for its own reasons, it had grave differences with these countries and simply didn't invite them to participate. It's probably likely that they would not have agreed to participate anyways, because the whole point of ACRES was that it was a group of the Middle East peace process, and participating implied agreement with the fundamental objective of the peace process. So Iran, Iraq, and Libya might not have participated, but the point is they were never even invited. And also Syria and Lebanon declined to participate. They were invited, but they took the view that until Israel had removed itself from the Golan Heights and signed a bilateral peace agreement with Syria, they weren't going to participate in these wider multilateral talks. So ACRES was never inclusive. And I think the first sort of lesson, if you will, is that any discussion on regional security and arms control needs to be inclusive. It needs to cover all of the countries of the region, or at least a seat needs to be left at the table for them to join if they wish to. And the definition of the region that came through in the ACRES discussions was a very interesting definition and has a lot of relevance to the situation we find ourselves in today. Essentially, ACRES defined the region as including all of the countries of the Arab League, plus Iran, plus Israel, and with some form of association for Turkey.
Peter,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. There's a couple of people having a little trouble hearing. If you can speak just a bit louder. It's working fine here, but some others are having a little trouble.
Perhaps I'll get a little closer. That's okay. Perhaps I'll get a little closer to the microphone. So first of all, then ACRES was not inclusive. And it defined the region as all of the countries of the Arab League, plus Iran, Israel, and Turkey. A second thing that was very interesting from the ACRES experience was that because ACRES was a working group of the Middle East peace process, which was created in Madrid in the early 1990s, it tended to create the idea that regional security was in some sense a subset of the Arab-Israeli peace process. That, in other words, the key problem of regional security in the Middle East, across the Middle East broadly, is the Arab-Israeli dispute. And that once that had been resolved, all other issues of regional security would fall into line. And of course, many people, not just Israel, but many people took the view that that was entirely the wrong approach, that there are many regional security problems across the Middle East, and that to take the view that the only one that is significant and matters is the Arab-Israeli dispute is misleading and puts too much pressure on that one dispute as the key to resolving everything else in the region. And a lot of people will tell you, people who study the region will tell you that many, many more people have died in conflicts between the Arab countries and within the Arab countries and between Iraq and Iran than have died in the Arab-Israeli dispute. Which is not to deny the importance of the Arab-Israeli dispute, but it's just to say it's not the only one. And therefore, a discussion of regional security and arms control should not take the Arab-Israeli dispute as its starting point in terms of how it defines regional security in the region. Another issue that bedeviled ACRES and was never able to be satisfactorily resolved was that ACRES took the view that the Middle East was essentially an entire region for security purposes. In other words, it stretched from Morocco to Iran, from Turkey to Sudan, and it was all one region. And that discussions on security issues were relevant to the entire region. And what became rapidly clear to those of us who were going to the meetings was that while there were certain regional issues that did in fact cover the entire region, and the nuclear question is one of them, of course, there were many others that were effectively sub-regional. And for example, security and confidence building in the Persian Gulf. I had several occasions where people from Morocco would tell me that, we really have nothing to do with the Persian Gulf. We're thousands of miles away and we don't really care that much if the Omani and Iranian navies are having trouble. We have problems here in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Western Mediterranean, and that's our problem area. And so some mechanism needs to be found if we're going to talk about regional security and regional arms control in the Middle East, to have an overlapping set of discussions which are both region-wide for those issues that matter in terms of region-wide issues, but also sub-regional, where those countries of the respective sub-regions can get together and talk about the things that matter to them. It's a very complicated diplomatic puzzle. It's a very complicated mechanism to set up, but it's never been set up yet. And Acres certainly had that flaw. And until we have that kind of a system, or at least begin to work towards it, it will be difficult to discuss broader issues of regional security in the Middle East. And finally, there was the problem that the way that Acres was set up, there was a sort of a structural problem, a trade-off that was built into Acres and became evident as the work went forward. And this was, of course, the differences over the question of nuclear weapons, signing the NPT first, or creating a regional security regime first. And this was the basis of the dispute that Israel and Egypt entered into as Acres went forward, and remains to this day. It's the dispute that Paul discussed in his comments about the failure of the Helsinki conference, at least up to this point. Essentially, as Acres got going, the Israelis took the view that they were prepared, they said so, they stated it on the record in the plenary, they were prepared to enter into a regional discussion of a weapons of mass destruction free zone, a nuclear weapon free zone. They were prepared to commit to that goal as a long-term goal. But they took the view that it would be a long-term goal. And first of all, there needed to be created a regional security system, which was inclusive, covered all the countries, and which was based upon a region-wide peace settlement, whereby all the countries recognized each other, recognized Israel, and so forth, and therefore sort of a region at peace would then lead to the creation of a weapons of mass destruction free zone. And the Israelis said they said that they weren't prepared under such circumstances to accept the non-proliferation treaty. They said that's a fundamentally flawed treaty in their view, but they would accept a regional binding equivalent, some sort of a regional agreement which would be a binding equivalent, a treaty, and which would be based perhaps on the NPT, but which, for example, would have additional and very specific protocols for verification specific to the Middle East that went beyond the standards held in the NPT. So that was their dynamic. We'll talk about confidence building, we'll talk about enhancing trust, we'll talk about how we get one day to the point where a region-wide treaty on arms control and disarmament is possible. The alternative view, which was put forward by the Egyptians at the head of the Arab delegations, although I have to say my own recollection, it was primarily the Egyptians who pushed it diplomatically, was that we need to have a regional WMD free zone in the near future. And this can be accomplished by everybody signing the relevant international instruments and being members in good standing. And the Egyptians said, we're prepared to discuss additional verification measures if people wish. But to begin with, everybody should sign up to the international non-proliferation standards. And then we'll go from there to discuss the creation of a regional security system and confidence building and all the rest of it. But that's the first step. And of course, the Israelis rejected that. So you had this fundamental divergence of view, which was built into Acres. And as the group went along through 1993 and 94 and into 95, it became harder and harder to get around that. It became more difficult to have meetings because positions hardened. I think the Egyptians were looking forward to the 1995 Review and Extension Conference and realizing that this was a moment when they could exert some pressure. And the Israelis simply dug their heels in and said they weren't prepared to talk about signing the NPT. They had a different vision. And so eventually Acres foundered on that. It was impossible to have meetings. The Egyptians simply said, well, we're not going to come to meetings. We're not going to allow these groups on confidence building measures to go forward if we're not going to get some indication from the Israelis that they are committed to signing the non-proliferation treaty and that they'll do it within a certain time frame. So Acres essentially stopped meeting in 1995. It should be said that all of the working groups of the peace process, including the refugee one that Canada hosted, stopped meeting a bit later because of wider problems with the peace process. Netanyahu had been elected, the peace process was faltering. But Acres ended before that over this breakup of on the question of the nuclear free zone. My own view at the time was that this was a missed opportunity. And while I recognized that the Egyptians had a point, it was not going to work. And it would have been a bit like us in the West, if you use a Cold War analogy, saying, we're not going to meet with the Russians and discuss European security and confidence building until they take the Berlin Wall down, which is a perfectly viable position. But if we'd taken it, the Cold War would have moved a lot differently. We took the view that while we have this fundamental difference of view with the Warsaw Pact over this issue, we're willing to discuss confidence building in the meantime and look to the day when these other issues can be resolved. So that would have been my view of the preferable way forward, but that's not the way it worked out, and acres went into abeyance. For the next many years, there have been a series of working groups at the Track 2 level. I've been involved in some of them. There have been many others, looking at regional security, regional arms control, the creation of a regional security system. There are a number of very good publications out there. I'd be happy to send references to many of them. I sent to this moderator of this discussion a little paper on acres and the lessons of it, if anyone is interested. So there's been a lot of discussion of all this over the years, but the basic positions that I outlined between Israel and Egypt have not changed going forward. And so when the Helsinki process was called for in 2010, I think a lot of us who've been through acres, we sort of looked at this and said, oh no, here we go again. I mean, unless there's been some fundamental change of view on the part of either the Israelis or the Egyptians, this is going to be another train wreck. And I think, unfortunately, that's essentially what's happened, because nobody's really changed their view. It was a very interesting idea to put forward this idea of some sort of a conference to begin this process. And there has been in the last year and a half, last 2 years, a number of conferences at the sort of Track 2, Track 1.5 level, if you put it that way, which have brought together many of those who were in acres. I've been to many of them. There have been papers written and compilations of papers published by different organizations looking at all these things. But once again, the fundamental difference of view, the positions haven't shifted. If anything, they've hardened between the two. And it does seem to me, one raises a question as to what is the agenda of those who keep pushing for this conference, or who keep pushing for this idea that the only acceptable way forward is for Israel to sign the NPT, and in the absence of that, there's no point in discussing anything. Because rightly, they may be right, they may be correct in the statement they're making as to what's desirable, but it's very clear that it's not going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. And therefore, to keep pushing it indicates to me other agendas. And I wonder what they may be. By way of a sort of a wrap up of my comments, let me try to put forward a few what I call lessons of the acres experience and lessons moving forward as we see the region today. The first lesson that I draw, and I've felt it for many years now, is that the Middle East is no different from other regions of the world in that a far-reaching regional arms control, regional disarmament system is not going to be accomplished in the absence of a regional cooperation and security system. There's no reason to expect the Middle East to be different in that respect. And if you have a situation where some countries of the region don't even recognize each other's existence, and there may be reasons for that, I'm not making a value judgment, I'm just saying it's a fact. How are you going to be able to create a region-wide inclusive security system? In every other region of the world where such systems have been created, including in regions where there were vast differences and considerable antagonisms, such as Europe during the Cold War, the countries essentially recognized each other's existence as a starting point. And that's not the case in the Middle East. So I think we're some years away, rightly or wrongly, from that happening. The second sort of broad lesson that I would draw from all these years is that the Middle East needs to have a discussion of regional security and disarmament for reasons that go beyond those of the Arab-Israeli dispute. The Arab-Israeli dispute is incredibly important, of course, and we all hope that it will move towards resolution. But there are so many other issues in the region, and the security issues are multiplying as the Arab Spring goes forward and regional governments change, and therefore to link any process to the Middle East peace process is wrong. And that was, I think, one of the benefits of linking it to the NPT. It had its drawbacks in other respects, but the benefit of linking it to the NPT in this respect was it took it away from the peace process. And I think that was a step forward. So I applaud that. The third point that I would make is that we need to get back to the recognition that process is valuable in itself. I think, once again, if you look at all the other regions of the world where there have been regional security systems, where regional disarmament agreements have emerged, they emerged out of a very long, in fact, a decades-long process of regional discussion, regional interaction, conferences, opportunities for the regional countries to educate one another about their concerns, to interact with each other. And it was in many ways that process which was a valuable thing in itself. One of the problems in ACRES, and particularly around this idea that Israel had to sign the NPT within a time-limited period, was that it made the discussions or the continuation of the discussions contingent upon a certain thing happening at a certain time. And once again, that's not been the case in other regions. People have recognized the value of the discussion going on in and of itself. And so I think we somehow need to find a way to inculcate that idea into the Middle East regional security discussion. Another point that I would make going forward is that given the fact that countries of the region don't recognize each other, it is necessary to explore some novel and interesting structures as to how we might go forward with a region-wide inclusive security and cooperation dialogue, at least in the first instance, until such time as countries in the region do come to recognize each other. And I think that there have been a number of people who've been looking at the idea of a kind of a semi-official track 1.5, whatever you might call it, sort of standing dialogue in the region on security and arms control issues. An open-ended dialogue which would bring together people from across the region. They could be officials, but they would obviously be in an academic setting, and therefore they wouldn't run afoul of the problem of potential recognition, which you get in official settings. That may be not the right way. There may be other ways to do it, but we're going to, given the reality of the Middle East, we're going to have to find some novel and innovative ways to allow this regional security discussion to go forward. And I think in that respect, there's a role for certain outside countries to be the hosts of that and to help stimulate it. The Scandinavian countries, other countries, Canada perhaps at one stage, I'm not sure about now given the current government policies in the region, perhaps I'm wrong, but nevertheless, however it's done, there is a role for some trusted, honest broker countries to try to stimulate some sort of a dialogue like that to begin exploring these issues and considering them in a way that will lead us to the goal that we all seek. One of the ideas that's come out of the various working groups and track 2 processes over the years that have gone on is what some people call geometry variable. And the idea being that there'd be a statement of principles to which all would agree, but how you get there would vary. I mean, some countries might be willing to meet at the official level, others wouldn't. So there might be a track 1 dialogue on some issues with some countries, a track 1.5 dialogue on other issues with other countries. But the point is to create and sustain an interlocking web of region-wide dialogues, which will allow this process to begin. Just simply showing up and saying, well, this country has to sign this agreement before anything else can happen, obviously hasn't worked for the past 20 years, and I don't see how it's going to work going forward. And finally, I think that we have to recognize that the overall goal of all this is not necessarily a particular agreement or a particular treaty, important though that is. The goal is a more secure Middle East. And that won't be achieved by particular agreements. It'll be achieved because of a new approach to regional security and regional dialogue and regional discussion, as was the case in Europe, as was the case in other regions where regions have transformed themselves. It'll also happen because of things entirely beyond the purview of the arms control and disarmament file. I mean, at the end of the day, the Cold War ended because the Soviet Union collapsed, rightly or wrongly. One can ask why that happened. But then a number of arms control things became possible after that. I think that in the Middle East, it won't be any different. Things are going to have to change. But in the meantime, discussion and dialogue is important to help manage that change when it comes. So perhaps I'll leave it there, Ernie. I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was terrific. You haven't had a chance to notice, but I think, Paul, you probably have, that there's been a fairly active discussion going on the discussion board, and there are some questions there that will be relevant for our discussion coming up. I think, I mean, if there's a question of clarification amongst them, it was one from Adele, and she was wondering about the rationale, Israel's rationale for what she called it secrecy. I think it's the neither confirm nor deny its possession of nuclear weapons. What's behind that, and also its relationship to the NPT. You touched upon the NPT in Israel to some extent, but maybe a little comment on this neither confirm nor deny, and then after that we'll go into the more open discussion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fairly widely accepted that Israel has a significant number of nuclear weapons and has had them since the late 60s. My understanding is that the position of Israel, which is, I believe the correct phrase is, Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East, is that it was a sort of a deal that was made with the United States administration, which agreed essentially to look the other way when Israel broke through the barrier and became a nuclear weapons state, against the American administration, at least officially against the American administration's desires. But they didn't. The Americans said, "Look, don't shove this in our face. Don't make us react to it." And so Israel has found this, what's sometimes known as an opaque nuclear stance, to be useful. I think they've also found it useful in terms of they feel it has not pressured other Arab countries to go nuclear. If they went nuclear overtly, if they tested and so on, some other Arab countries might feel they had to do so diplomatically. So I think there's a number of issues bound up with that. In terms of the second part of Adele's question, I'm just sort of reading it here on the screen. Yeah, I think my understanding, Adele, is that you said the P5 feel no need to cease their non-compliance with Article 6. My understanding is that the NPT is kind of a closed book, and the countries that were nuclear weapon states on the date of its coming into force, 1968, the 5, are the only ones. And to go back and admit new countries as nuclear weapon states would involve completely reopening the treaty. And that would occasion all kinds of problems. I mean, Paul is a much more expert on this than I am, but I think that that's the situation. So, I mean, for example, in the case of India, the Americans have tried to work around to essentially bestow upon India all the benefits of being a nuclear weapon state in terms of joining various supplier control regimes and nuclear cooperation agreements without reopening the NPT. But that's my understanding of the situation.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, we're now going to move towards a more open discussion, and participants, you can turn your mics on at particular points and ask questions. This section we want to look a little bit more into the future, in that Paul and Peter have given us a very good background on where we came to this point, and now we're wanting to look forward a little bit. And I'm going to invite Paul and Peter both to make quite brief comments on what you think the prospects are. Sergei Plekhanov's question is a good opener for that, for you in particular, Paul, in that he was saying, was the call for a Middle East conference really just a kind of pro forma cover for things, and was it ever really realistic, and what's the prospect for such a conference in the future? Steve Staples and Metta Spencer have both raised the issue of the open-ended working group that's now a new forum in the UN system, and whether there are prospects within that group that are relevant to the Middle East question, the Middle East nuclear weapons question. So a few brief comments from you, Paul, then I'll turn to Peter. We're going to do this with both of you are viewed on our screens with your photographs, so we don't have to shift back and forth with the web cameras. And then when that's when we've heard from you, then we're going to go to the microphones and have some comments and introductions.
Well, thanks, Ernie. I'm not fully sure in this section. I think you had indicated you wanted us to sort of cast forward as to what might represent next steps vis-a-vis the problem we've described. I guess all I can say is that the prospects do not seem bright to resolve this. Part of it is the dynamics of the Middle East. Things do not stay static, and the situation that pertains today is not the same as the situation at the time of the May 2010 review conference, when the decision was taken to hold the conference, nor was it the same as the situation even in the spring of 2011, when the facilitator was finally appointed to carry on the consultations. And I think even the casual observer would note that there's been a deterioration of the political security condition in the region. It's evidently a bit of a stretch to be working on a conference to discuss a WMD-free zone in the Middle East when sarin gas is being used in Syria. The first instance of chemical weapons use anywhere in the world since probably the Iraq-Iran war of the late 1980s. So to see a solution here, it would require also a common front on the part of the three influential states, the conveners. And here again, regrettably, I think the Syrian crisis has opened up new ruptures, particularly between Russia on one hand and the US and the UK on the other. And that doesn't help matters. We will have to see what the consequences ultimately of failure to convene the meeting will have for this wider framework of the NPT. And here I think maybe we have to distinguish between general public opinion and elite opinion, if I can use those terms, in that I think generally it will be readily accepted by the public that upheavals, political security upheavals in the Middle East make a postponement of this conference, I think, readily acceptable. So in that sense, there may not be the same sort of downside for the conveners if this doesn't happen. And though I wouldn't like to ascribe such cynicism to those convening countries, I think the manner in which this operationalization of the Middle East resolution occurred provides them, in the person of the facilitator, with someone who can be the fall guy for the failure of this conference. They being the convener states, are somewhat removed now from responsibility. So if the facilitator comes back and says, despite all my efforts, I can't get the states to agree to meet, you can have Washington, Moscow, and London collectively sigh and lament this unfortunate development, but they may not feel the heat in the same way as if it was directly their responsibility to put all this together. I think a big question out there is the impact on the NPT process. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, clearly there are some pretty thinly veiled threats by Arab states to disrupt the NPT review conference, possibly even the next meeting of the NPT, which would be the 2014 preparatory conference that would normally be held in New York in the spring. There were already sort of rumors prior to the April meeting of this year that there could be a boycott by the Arab states of the meeting. And I think they might well revive that tactic, and it would in a way be rather painless for them, as this is not the key decision-making meeting. That would be the 2015 review conference, but it would be a potent sort of symbolic move if they said, we've had enough of this process, there's been a failure to honor commitments made, and we're not going to participate any longer. I think for observers of this, will be particularly noteworthy to monitor Egyptian statements and actors and actions, as Egypt has been really the leader on this, and how they conduct themselves, I think, would be a harbinger of how the sort of broader Arab coalition will act within the NPT. So rather bleak out there. And the linkages that Peter discussed are still, unfortunately, very much with us. And unless there is a new willingness to exercise flexibility on the part of the states involved, I see little prospect of success in this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Not upbeat exactly, but frank. And Peter, just briefly, any comments on where we're headed? And then I'm going to call on some people who've indicated they're interested in asking a question from the discussion board here. But first, Peter.
Well, just keying off Sergei's question about the conference, the decision to cancel the conference being entirely predictable. I have to say I agree with that. It didn't have to be that way, but once it became clear, I went to some of the meetings at the 2010 NPT around this issue of the Middle East resolution in New York, and it rapidly became clear as the meetings proceeded that nobody was going to take a different view from the views they'd taken all those years ago in Acres, or at least they weren't indicating a willingness to do so. And as this process has gone forward leading up to what should have been the Helsinki meeting, positions have become more firmly entrenched, if anything else. And so, I mean, I have to ask at this point, what is the objective of those who are pushing this issue, this particular position that Paul has rightly said is primarily being pushed by Egypt? Other Arab countries are vocally supportive, but none of them went out of the meeting with Egypt as Egypt did before. The Arab League has become very vocally engaged in this issue, at least its arms control division has. I've been going to Cairo for many years now. I've been there 3 times in the last year on other business, but I've made a point of seeing my friends from Acres days and talking with those working on these issues in the foreign ministry. And it I think was clear even to them as much as 6 to 8 to 10 months ago that they weren't going to get what they wanted. They had perhaps been hoping, I think, rather foolishly, that at some point the Americans would pressure the Israelis to sign the NPT. And I mean, maybe the Americans should do that. Maybe that's right, but it's not going to happen in the real world, at least not with this administration and for the foreseeable future. And so it was clear that they weren't going to get what they wanted. And so they'd sort of painted themselves into a corner in a way. And it may be that this business of them getting up and walking out of the NPT meeting recently was a way of letting off steam, that they could show that we've held true to our position, but as Paul said, without really doing much damage in a real sense, and it sort of live to fight another day, so to speak, and keep the issue going. I think there's also a discussion to be had about the sort of the linkage of this issue to perhaps some wider goals that those who are pushing it have. There have been a train of thought amongst some analysts of the region that Egypt has been looking to reclaim or retain over the years its position as a leader of the Arab world, which is, some feel it's lost. And this issue might be a sort of a natural issue where they can do that. There's no downside to blaming Israel for the problems of the region, and you can stand up on a matter of principle where you know things aren't going to change soon anyways. That's a very cynical view, but some people have suggested that that may be what's going on. It's also important, I think, to note that the dynamic in Egypt right now, I was there just a month ago, is that all decisions of consequence are being taken in the office of President Morsi. And the Egyptian Foreign Ministry is, having been during the time of Mubarak, a very powerful institution within the Egyptian government, is now a shadow of its former self in terms of its influence. And yet this issue continues to be dealt with by the Foreign Ministry, not by the President's office. And Morsi has yet to engage. So I wonder if perhaps the American view is that, we can let the Egyptian Foreign Ministry blow off steam as much as it likes, but when the time gets serious to really make some compromises around the time of the 2015 actual conference, then we'll go to Morsi's office and see what we can do there. That's a dangerous game. It might not work, but that may be part of the dynamic what's happening here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Peter. Well, we're going to open discussion. We have we have about 40 minutes left. I have three persons on the speakers list, and in addition to that, I invite Paul and Peter to look on the discussion board to look at the comment and question made by Douglas Roach and Sergei Plekhanov, and whether if you could just review those quickly and incorporate some response to them. But then in addition to that, we have three people, Walter Dorn, Cesar Yaramilov, and Derek Paul on the list, and I'm going to call on them in that order. When we get a little bit further down, just before Derek's question, we'll assess how much time we have left, and if there's still time left, we'll then invite additional comment or question. Walter Dorn, could you pose your question? Do you and you know to activate your mic?
Hi, Ernie. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Hi, Walter.
Great. Thanks, Ernie. Well, thank you to you and Elizabeth for both the substance of the idea for this conference, this workshop, or this online panel, and the procedure. I think it's just fascinating that we can do it this way. I want to bring up the issue of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Israel has signed it but not ratified it, and Egypt has not signed it, and I think making linkages to a larger WMD-free zone. What's the possibility that any of those positions can be modified or that we can get progress at least on the chemical weapons? And is there a linkage? Can it play a positive or a negative role in this situation? That's more a question than a discussion.
Well,
Both Paul and
just to Walter's point, I mean, you'll recall that the resolution, the Middle East resolution, was constructed to refer to a WMD-free zone. And I think that represented Western input because the Arab focus was exclusively on the nuclear dimension and the non-adherence by Israel to the NPT. So from its origins, it was acknowledged that other WMD elements would have to be part of a move towards a zone. And indeed, even delivery systems, which would encompass then presumably negotiations on ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, or indeed even combat aircraft. So it was widely conceived, and I think to some degree, thinking in places like Cairo and Damascus did turn on the sense of holding back on ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention and indeed the Biological Weapons Convention as potential leverage in some future negotiation. And I think that's informed Israeli thinking as well.
Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and as Paul notes and Walter notes, you know, the issue is not just nuclear, and in fact, I mean, the Middle East has the rather sorry distinction of being a place where WMD have been used since the Second World War. They were used in the Iran-Iraq War, of course, quite extensively. Used by Egypt in Yemen during the Yemeni civil war when Egypt intervened. Used in Syria. Used in Iraq against its own people. So, and in each of these cases, it had nothing to do with Israel. So this idea that the WMD problem in the region is all about nuclear and all about Israel is wrong, which is not to let Israel off the hook, but it's just wrong. And I agree with Paul's analysis that the idea is that, you know, withholding ratification of certain other agreements, such as the CWC, is seen by some as a way of perhaps putting on diplomatic pressure to Israel in some endgame. I think we're seeing also that Syria has long regarded the possession of chemical weapons as some kind of a possible deterrent to Israel's nuclear capability. Can positions change? I think my sense right now is everything is stuck. And it would be very nice and a very good idea to try to have a sort of an incremental progress with respect to the WMD issue. And if we can't work on nukes, let's try and work on chemicals and so on. But I think that sort of a very elaborate set of positions has been constructed over the last 20 years and reinforced to such a degree that now it's very difficult to imagine, you know, dismantling any one part of the scaffold without dismantling the whole thing. With regard to the question of WMD free zone, the first reference to it actually comes from the Egyptian government. And it was in a plan put forward by President Mubarak in the 80s, I believe, the Mubarak plan, which was picking up on a proposal made by the Shah of Iran for a nuclear weapon free zone. The Egyptians picked it up and put it forward as an idea for a WMD free zone. I think largely for political reasons they constructed it in that way, but that's, to my knowledge, the first reference to the idea.
Thanks very much. I'm again, Paul and Peter, if you can have a look at those some of those questions on the board, but in particular, and maybe it's Paul to speak to this one, that is on the open-ended working group and its relevance to this question. I've been reminded of that again. While you're doing that, I'm going to call on Cesar Yaramilo to pose a question.
Thanks, Ernie, and thanks to the two speakers for the wonderful presentations. I had a question regarding sequencing and the notion of preconditions, which people familiar with the NPT processes know that this notion of preconditions has been a recurring theme throughout NPT review conferences and preparatory committees. In the specific context of the WMD, the pursuit of a WMD free zone in the Middle East, there seem to be two vastly different narratives. One, which seems to be favored by the Arab states, is that the pursuit and, in fact, the establishment of a nuclear WMD free zone in the Middle East would make a significant contribution to broader regional peace. But the other position, which some people find troubling, is and has some Israeli officials have endorsed, is quite the opposite. That regional peace is a necessary precondition for realistically achieving a WMD free zone in the Middle East. Now, if one takes the latter as the predominant discourse that permeates this process, I mean, one doesn't need to be a cynic to realize that it's just a recipe for indefinitely delaying the establishment of a WMD-free zone in the region if it is contingent upon securing the peace that has eluded this region for decades. So I was wondering if either of you had any comments of how you can reconcile these two positions, if they can in fact be reconciled.
Great, thank you, Cesar. And just remind you that we have Derek on the list to speak, and now also Doug Roach on the list. But first, Paul, and then Peter.
Okay, thanks, Cesar, for that question. I think actually, well, it's correct to sort of say the idealized regional peace, to make that a precondition is probably unrealistic and could be a source of delay. But I think there are very credible and necessary political steps. Peter has already reminded us that in a situation where some of the states of the region deny the existence of other states of the region is not conducive to coming up with a common enterprise of a nuclear or WMD-free zone. That doesn't occur in any of the other areas where those zones exist. And I think it is a realistic point as one looks for progress that you have to be able to get over, that basic, and one might even say petty, kind of denial of the recognition of other states if you really want to cooperate. And UN-approved guidelines for creating these zones have always said they have to be entered in voluntarily by all the states of the region concerned. So there's, I think, some validity in some prior political steps to facilitate this. Let me briefly just refer to the questions about the open-ended working group. I think that's quite a different subject. We might one day have a workshop just on that. I think the connection, if you will, is with the NPT, not with its regional security concern in the Middle East that we're discussing this afternoon, but rather frustration over the lack of progress on realizing nuclear disarmament commitments under the NPT, and that has led to a number of states to try to generate attention to alternative ways of making progress, and the one manifestation of that has been the creation of this open-ended working group, which has just concluded last month, an initial session in Geneva. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think Cesar has very, very well summed up the basic problem here, and I congratulate him. I mean, those are the two positions, and they are effectively at this point zero-sum positions. Either you subscribe to the Egyptian position or the Israeli position, and there's no middle ground. And it's been difficult to persuade people that a middle ground is necessary, because a mood has seeped into the regional discourse on arms control that for either side to back off its position would be seen as being some sort of a loss or weakness or something of that nature. My own view is that the only way forward between this sort of Egyptian position that it's disarmament first and then regional security later, and the Israeli position that it's regional security first and then disarmament later, is to split the difference and to say, look, it's not an either or. As one works towards regional disarmament, one also works towards regional security. And the two discussions they're really in many ways the same discussion, and they're mutually reinforcing. The key is not to have any deadlines and not to say that, we've got to achieve X result, whether it's signing the NPT or everybody recognizing Israel or whatever it is, by a certain date, because it'll be conditions on the ground that determine whether those things will happen or not, and when they happen and how they happen. In the meantime, I would argue that beginning the discussion and examining the issues. And there's an awful lot that needs to be talked about here. You know, for example, I mean, I'm you know, a veteran of these discussions for many years, and people will just blithely say, "Oh yes, there needs to be you know, some sort of regional verification provision as part of this," but nobody has a clue what that means. Nobody's really sat down at a very expert technical level and said, "Well, what would a Middle East regional verification system for a Middle East WMD free zone look like, given the legacy of the region where people have surreptitiously developed these weapons? Many different countries have developed these weapons or are suspected of doing so. Given the lack of trust, given the inexperience of these countries with on-site inspection, and I can tell you from the Acres days, the very significant resistance of the regional militaries to the idea of on-site inspections. I mean, that in itself is a multi-year discussion, and we're not having it. And it's never been allowed to get going because the thing is blocked by this basic dispute. So my recommendation as to the way forward is for both sides to climb down a little bit, split the difference on their positions, and recognize that there are lots of things that need to be discussed in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now call on Derek Paul.
I just have my main comment is follow on. Oh, I also want to say it's a great pleasure to me to have two colleagues who stick to their very difficult task and follow these extremely difficult points. And I want to follow mostly a comment of Peter's that he reiterated in answer to one of the questions. Everything is stuck, and I think he said, "Don't dismantle the scaffold." It struck me that when things are as bogged down as they are in the area of security from weapons of mass destruction, maybe the way out of this is to broaden the concept of security. And I remember that Europe was stuck at one time, the Soviet threat, and one of the things that did more than anything else to get us out of it was the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki essentially broadened security into three very broad baskets, and I would think that I'm going to give you some reasons why I think that the Middle Eastern countries and the North African, especially the Arab, as against Israel, are in a mess from a long-term point of view, and that a major set of baskets which dealt with their overall long-term security might be very helpful in easing the military security forward. So I would urge people such as Peter not to concentrate 100% on the military security, but say, it hasn't worked, let's broaden the picture and let's get it more comprehensive. Now, I want to give you two reasons why I think this is important. I don't know if any of you have looked at a map of the world of the ecological footprints, but the nations between Algeria and Iran constitute about half of the nations in the world that have the highest ecological footprints. That means that they are heading for disaster either because of the way they live, burning too much gasoline, or because they're overpopulated, and Egypt is probably an example of that. The second thing about those countries is that if you look at the climate models, North Africa and Middle East, by the sometime in the second half of this century, they are going to be completely dry. And this strikes me as a security issue of the absolutely first order. And so for these reasons, I would think it would be extremely valuable to broaden the concept of security and have an umbrella group that's perhaps similar to what we had with Helsinki, that deals with a much broader region. And I think when things get cooperative and friendly and looking at those issues, the military ones will start to look a little smaller eventually. It will take time, of course, as Peter and Paul doubtless know. I have one final comment, and that is that the...
if you can make that quickly.
It's very quick. That
Great.
the getting Israel to join the NPT should be easy. Just tell them it doesn't matter. Everybody violates it, so they can join and violate, and they'll be just like all the others.
Except there's a precondition. It needs to become a non-nuclear weapon state before it could become. Peter, but thank you, Derek, for all of those good points. And Peter, do you have a response?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I mean, I completely agree with the point that Derek has made, and I'd be happy to send him or send the broader group some work that's been done on the idea of regional security systems in the Middle East. One thing that I know, going back to Acres days and in a lot of the work since, there's a tremendous sensitivity in the region to suggesting that something like the Helsinki idea can just be sort of picked up and placed in the Middle East. There's a no, we're terribly unique and original, and we can't just transplant ideas and all that. But I mean, I think the general concept of a wider approach to security is absolutely right. And as I say, there's some work that's been done on that by people in the region to look at whether that could work. The problem at a political and diplomatic level is that, frankly speaking, and I'm being very blunt here, there are some regimes in the region that don't want that discussion. Because once you broaden the discussion of security and you bring in human rights and other things, they feel that they will be, as the British would say, on the back foot. So they simply, whenever suggestions are made to broaden the agenda and bring in those issues, they block it. And they're quite happy to keep the focus on one particular issue, the NPT, and one particular country, Israel, and say, once that's done, everything will be fine. That's a very cynical comment, but that unfortunately is the...
Thank you, Peter. Paul, I'm going to go to the next person to make a comment or ask a question. But if you want to respond to Derek, maybe you can do that in the next segment. But for now, I'm going to go to Douglas Roach. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Ernie. Can you hear me, Ernie?
Yes, we can indeed.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to repeat the thanks to both Paul and Peter for excellent presentations, and secondly, to congratulate Pugwash for this extremely valuable form of electronic workshop. I think it has terrific potential for the future. Now, reference was made a while ago that the present upheavals in the Middle East might make the postponement of the conference more acceptable. And it was mentioned that thus the conveners might feel themselves removed from responsibility. Well, that is not a view that I would share. It's the responsibility of the conveners to get this conference done. It's bad enough for the nuclear weapon states, including principally the three conveners. It's bad enough for them to not be living up to their responsibilities for Article 6. And indeed, in that context, I call to your attention the excellent article that's just been published by Judge Weramantry on the lack of good faith, or bad faith, as he puts it, by them in respect to Article 6. That's bad enough. Now, for these states to remove themselves from responsibility for the Middle East is a double blow, and it's a blow to the NPT. I find it hard to believe that although the difficulties with Israel on the one hand and the Arab states on the other, while difficult, I don't think they're intractable. That's my view, that they are not intractable. And I find it hard to believe that the diplomatic powers of the conveners are so ineffective that they cannot massage or come to some sort of accommodation by which the Arab states, or the remaining Arab states that need to do so, would recognize Israel, and that Israel would drop its stern view that there has to be a Middle East peace established before they'll come to a nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction table. I really feel that diplomacy has matured sufficiently that this can be established, this can be done. Finally, this is a question that involves the Middle East, of course, but it involves the veracity and even the viability of the NPT. The 2010 conference of the NPT made it very clear that there would be such a conference in fulfillment of the 1995 pledge, and all of us who were there at 1995 know how vital that Middle East resolution was at that time. And so I see this as a matter in which the nuclear weapon states, I see the lack of a Middle East conference to be so important that it challenges the viability of the NPT, and that ought to be a prime concern to the convening states, and that a way needs to be found to get them to assume their responsibilities to get this conference convened. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug. I'm going to ask both Paul and Peter for response to that, and then which I think will be the final question of the day, will come from Sergei Plekhanov. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, for those comments. You know, in diplomacy, you can simplify matters or you can complicate matters. And I think what we are seeing at this stage in this particular endeavor is a willingness on a number of parties to complicate matters. Frankly, if the real objective is to get Israel to attend a meeting, then you think the other concerned states should show a lot of flexibility about the nature of that meeting. And the facilitator in coming up with this proposal for a multilateral consultation in Geneva put it forward without preconditions. You know, these are talks about talks, and as such, he felt it would be most successful if the parties gathered, but without prior commitments or conditions to that initial exchange. I remind you, this is not the conference itself. This would be a consultation about the conference. And yet you had in the Arab League comments and those of Egypt at the preparatory committee meeting, a demand that they weren't prepared to go along with this. And they indicated that such a consultation would have to have an agenda, a precise agenda. It would have to have a framework. It would have to be held under the UN umbrella. And that it would have to coincide with the announcement of a date for the conference. Those conditions, if you will, in my mind, do complicate the achievement of even this very modest step towards meeting the goal. So I think it's feasible for this conference to be held, and the demand that it, terms of reference, be the Middle East resolution, in my mind, allows for discussion of issues like conventional arms and regional security and conference building, things that have been suggested Israel will want as part of any conference. So while those prospects may be dim, I think it's well within practical diplomacy to find a formula that at least allows this preliminary consultation to take place. But I think there are other calculations informing the behavior from some capitals, and at the moment it doesn't seem that that kind of pragmatism is going to prevail.
Thanks a lot. Peter, any comment on this? And then
Yeah, a couple of comments on Doug's questions. First of all, on his suggestion about the Arab states recognizing Israel in return for Israel dropping its objection to the NPT. I'm not sure that's the thing that would get the Arab states to drop their, to recognize Israel. They have made an offer, however, to recognize Israel and live in peace with Israel in return for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. And that was an offer first made by the Saudis and picked up by the Arab League and reiterated a couple of times by the Arab League. And I think it's to Israel's great discredit and America's great discredit that there's never really been an Israeli response to it. And it seems to me that if that could be achieved, the Israeli-Palestinian issue could be resolved satisfactorily, then we would have a basis for a new regional diplomacy on a number of different issues. So I think that's the trade-off in terms of recognition of Israel. It's not so much the NPT as the Palestinian issue. With regard to the second comment that the survival of the NPT is at stake here, I mean, I think that's a good point. And it, again, as I said a moment ago, and as Paul just said a second ago, it raises the question: why are some countries taking zero-sum positions on this? I mean, when they know that it won't go forward if they continue to take those positions, what is the objective? Anybody, as I said in my comments, anybody who lived through the Acres experience could see this train wreck coming 2 years ago, unless people were willing to change positions on both sides. And it seems like nobody's done so. So either this isn't so serious an issue for the future of the NPT as we think it is, and therefore countries like Egypt and the Arab League can take positions and blow off steam, and it doesn't really hurt in the end, or it is in fact a serious position, and because they've painted themselves into a corner and don't know how to get out, they're willing to do damage to the NPT in order to avoid having to climb down. Either of those is, in my mind, an unacceptable situation.
Peter, well, we're coming to the end of our 2 hours, and Sergey, you have the floor.
I'd like to continue. First of all, thank you very much for organizing it, and thank you, Paul and Peter, for excellent remarks. It's a very rich discussion that we're having. I would like to pick up on that point of creatively using the experience of the Cold War, because the parallels between the hopelessness with regard to the possibility of any progress in arms control up until the breakthroughs of the early 70s is really a useful reminder that you can actually hopelessly continue with negotiations and going back and forth on these issues. Well, how can you have sensible arms control in the absence of a broader agreement on security and peace, or the other way around? So progress on both fronts is possible, of course, and the lesson from the years leading from the Cold War to détente is very instructive. Yes, you can have a creative interaction between negotiations, arms control, and a broader. Okay, so I think that we have to ask ourselves, why did this interaction between consultations and negotiations on security, and particularly in Europe in the 1960s and the 1970s, and parallel progress in arms control, why did that interaction suddenly become productive? And I think one of the things here was the changing balance of power. The changing balance of power and the emergence of a kind of a balance of power between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, and an introduction of a new geopolitical discourse that transformed thinking about the broader issues of the Cold War, peaceful coexistence, and so on and so forth. And I think that if we use that experience with regard to the Middle East, I think that we are witnessing major changes in the regional balance of power, which is becoming more multipolar. And that multipolarity might be the factor which could change perceptions of security, the role of nuclear weapons, and so on in every capital in the Middle East, in particular in Israel, because I can understand why it is hard for the Israelis to imagine that they can actually give up nuclear weapons when they are surrounded by basically a hostile international environment, regional environment, and they could avoid serious conversations about nuclear weapons free zone until and unless they're 100% certain that their security is assured. Now, the fact that you now have a much strengthened and growing Iran, the fact that you have a new Turkey now, which is reasserting its regional role, the fact that Egypt is a more independent actor today and under a new political regime is pursuing different directions in its foreign policy, I think those factors could actually contribute to a more realistic and kind of realpolitik informed discourse between major players in the region, including Israel, on how to assure security, how to make all the states less concerned about security threats, and ultimately agree to some sort of a process leading to greater regional security, and as part of that, also possibly to some kind of nuclear weapons free zone.
Thank you very much, Sergey. I'm going to go now to Paul and Peter for what are going to have to be fairly brief final comments. Our computers aren't all going to turn into pumpkins at 4 o'clock, but we're sort of committed to ending it roughly there. But we do want to hear from you, and so say respond to Sergey, of course, and anything else that you have on your mind. First, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Ernie, and Sergey rightly, recalls that during the Cold War, that despite very sharp ideological opposition and divides, countries on either side of the Iron Curtain were still able to enter into mutually beneficial international security agreements. And really because there was a recognition that their security depended on a modicum of cooperation with others from the other camp, as it were. And one would hope that that kind of realism would also animate this process going forward. What I worry about is that the international security benefit that the NPT represents is being devalued in the eyes of a number of states, such that problems on something like the Middle East could eventually, as I suggested in my opening remarks, be seized upon as a pretext for withdrawal from the NPT. And I do think there is a risk to that regime. And what Peter described in a way is a scary prospect of a sort of reckless approach by some Arab states, most likely to be prepared to, in a sense, do damage to the NPT rather than admit a failure in achieving this particular Middle Eastern, the aims of the Middle East resolution. So there are, I think, really uncomfortable risks and dangers going forward that may not be immediately apparent to us.
Thank you, Paul. Peter.
Thank you. I'd make three comments quickly in response to Sergey's point. First of all, one of the things I've noticed in many years of working in the Middle East on regional security issues is a tremendous sense of regional exceptionalism that one sees there. Sort of, yes, other regions of the world have had their problems, but nobody's had it worse than us, and nobody can hate each other more than we can hate each other. And it's all very nice for you to quote this experience in Europe, but that was different. Our problems are worse. And I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that there are other regional experiences that can usefully be looked at in the Middle East. Obviously, they're not absolutely directly applicable. No other region's experience is directly applicable to any other region's experience. But nevertheless, there is this sense in the Middle East, and I think it's cultural and historical that no other regional set of experiences is relevant to us, and it takes a long time to overcome that. Secondly, as you note, there is significant change underway in the region, and that has in other contexts been a moment when positive things could happen. And that may happen in the Middle East, but right now I sense everybody's being cautious because they don't know where this change is going and what's going to happen. So perhaps in a year or two, as things settle down, if they do settle down in a year or two, that might be the moment to introduce the notion that the region needs to start thinking about a different future. But right now, my feeling is it's unlikely to be the case. Finally, an issue that I think needs to be addressed, and this is more one for Israel to address more than anything else, is they have a rather particular and unique conception of the word deterrence. When other countries talk about nuclear deterrence, what they're talking about is, we have a weapon, another country has a weapon, and our mutual possession of these weapons deters the use by the other side. Whereas the Israeli conception of deterrence has always been that we should be the only ones who have these things, and that if anybody else seeks to get one, that we should stop it, because then we will not be able to deter them. Well, what they're in fact really talking about is we want to retain an overwhelming unilateral advantage, which we can use as and when we see fit to dominate the region's security affairs, and we won't tolerate someone else negating that advantage by also achieving a nuclear weapon. And so it's a very different conception of deterrence. And when Israeli officials say, we've got to stop Iran from getting a weapon or Israel's deterrent will be weakened, in fact, what they're saying is we do not wish to be in a situation of actual classical deterrence. And I think the Israelis have got to figure out a way to move off that position because they are the great power of the region in conventional terms, economically. They don't really need nuclear weapons. It's more of a psychological thing, and perhaps it has to do with the particular history of Israel and the Jewish people. It's understandable, but it's a position which holds that at the end of the day, we must be the only one with these things. And obviously that's not going to lead us anywhere. So that too needs.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that draws our discussion to a close, and on behalf of Elizabeth, and I think I can speak for Walter as well, who is the Canadian Pugwash chair. Huge thanks to all of you for participating. I think we've had a high quality of discussion. We've learned a lot about the background. I think we're going to become much more informed observers and participants in the discussion of the Middle East question going forward, and that's part of what we wanted to do. Thanks to the participants for actively engaging in the discussion board, as well as your questions through the mic. Particular thanks, of course, to Paul Meyer and Peter Jones. We have in the two of them an excellent resource, and your willingness to take the time to do this for us is hugely appreciated, and we may just keep calling on you in the future. Also, thanks to the Security Governance Group for facilitating this whole enterprise. Remind you that a podcast of today's meeting will be available and will be posted onto the Canadian Pugwash Group website, and we'll send you a notice of that when that's up. And I also remind you to look on the right-hand side of your screen. You will see future events and some questions, a brief questionnaire. And I encourage you to fill that out before you sign off, and that will help us in, we hope, organizing similar kinds of events on other topics. And of course, we welcome suggestions for other topics to cover in the future. I think, from my point of view, this is a terrific way of meeting, and I hope we meet again out there in cyberspace.